Morning. My name's Devin Jopp, CEO of American College Health Association, and we're pleased to welcome both our guests in person and online via our live stream for today's event. Before we get started, just to remind everybody that we are running 2 concurrent sessions. This is also online, but also here locally. The session on building the culture of campus well-being is next door, or if you're online, it's on the other live link. A couple of other housekeeping items before we get started. First, we are live streaming, and therefore would like to ask our audience to please keep conversations to a minimum around cameras in order to ensure a great viewing experience for our online audience. Additionally, we'd like to remind our panelists and audience that this event is being recorded. So I'd like to ask all attendees to please now silence their cell phones. Second, we will build in several breaks throughout our day together and tomorrow as well. During this time, we'll continue the live stream portion of the event, so our online attendees are welcome to leave on their feeds or log out and log back in at the appropriate time. Regarding questions today, since we are live streaming, we would like to ask all participants to please submit your questions via a website called sli.do, S-L-I.do, and enter the code ACHA-PGM2. That's ACHA-PGM2. We'll queue up your questions and we'll ask them for our panelists throughout the day. If you're here in the room and would like to ask a question, you're welcome to submit it online or simply raise your hand and we'll have the moderator repeat the question for you. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize our nonprofits supporting our organization's event today, including Active Minds, ACPA, the American Council of Education, the Association for University and College Counseling Center Directors, George Washington University, the JED Foundation, Mid-Atlantic College Health Association, NASPA, and NERSA. I want to thank all of our partners for the promotion of this event, and also would like to thank the American College Health Foundation for partnering with us on our event today, as well as thanking our gold sponsor Aetna and silver sponsor Roboff for their generous support in making today's event possible. I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank our co-host for this event, George Washington University. They have a very long history in supporting student well-being, and we're very grateful for them providing the space today. With the housekeeping behind us, I'd like to welcome everyone to ACHA's Leadership and Innovation Summit on addressing our students' food and shelter needs. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today. Since 1920, the American College Health Association has served as the voice of student health and well-being. Through advocacy, research, and education, ACHA stands at the forefront of issues that impact the health and wellness of our college students. Back in 2017, the summit key health and well-being that are impacting our students today. This year, we expanded our program because we recognize that we cannot talk about student well-being without also addressing 2 critical issues plaguing our students today, which is food and housing insecurity, otherwise known as campus homelessness. Not deserving the attention that it deserves, and it's even dismissed as an issue. According to the Temple University and Wisconsin Hope Lab, 36% of students say that they are food insecure and 9% report being homeless. How can we expect students to achieve academically when we cannot ensure that their basic needs of food and housing are met? Our goal for this summit is to identify and look at new innovations that can help spread best practices that are being used to address food insecurity and housing insecurity on our nation's campuses. At the same time, we want to encourage policymakers through this event to please modify laws and regulations to help alleviate these issues in our college and university communities and to provide support for these students. We're very fortunate to have an incredible lineup of talented and passionate panelists today. It's my pleasure today to introduce our first panel, which is a session entitled Addressing the Well-Being of a Diverse Student Body. I'd like to introduce our moderator for the day, or for this particular session, Kim Webb, who's the Director of Relationship and Sexual Violence Prevention Center at Washington University in St. Louis. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first panel of the day. As Devin said, it's addressing the well-being of a diverse student body. And I would like to spend some time introducing the panel that is joining this morning. First is Deidre Dayne, who is the Senior Program Advisor with the Steve Fund. Next to Deidra is Sara Oswalt, Professor and Department Chair of Kinesiology, Health and Nutrition at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Micah Griffin is also joining us, Director of Health and Counseling Center at Alabama A&M University. and Pritma Mickey Irizarry is the Director of Health Promotion and Advocacy Center at American University. Panelists, thank you so much for joining us this morning. The goal of the discussion is to understand how the promotion of student well-being varies depending on a variety of considerations. What challenges institutions are facing in promoting well-being, and how well-being has changed over time as the national student body diversifies. So there's a lot of discussion these days about student well-being, and I would like to open today's panel discussion by asking Deidre Dayne to talk with us about how students' background can influence their well-being and how well-being can vary from student to student. So Deidre.
Thank you very much, Kim. And good morning. My name is Deidre Dayne. Just a quick sentence about the Steve Fund for those of you who may not know. We are the nation's only nonprofit that serves and supports the mental health and emotional well-being of students of color. And this is important in this particular question and, of course, for this summit, because very often when I go to conferences and we go to conferences, we find that some of the data that are provided don't quite dive deep enough into some of the nuances and the segments that address students of color. We know that though the rates of mental health and mental illness are relatively the same across races and ethnicities and backgrounds, indeed, students of color face greater distress very often for their when they first encounter the college experience and they're having that first time away from home. The question in particular, does the unique background of a student have something to do with their well-being? Obviously it does, very much so. It's this transactional relationship between the community where the student is coming from. Very often for students of color, that may be for Native Americans, for example, it may be a rural area, it may be a culture where an Asian American family where the student has highly achieved their academic success in school. They get to college, perhaps they are the first generation in college, and they experience high anxiety around being pressure to succeed and to persevere. And in that culture and many others, there's a huge stigma against, first of all, admitting that there might be anxiety for which help is needed, but then to go and get help. Seek help. We know that actually of a great deal of students report feeling anxious and depressed when they first encounter and experience the freshman year, but in fact only half of those actually seek help. And unfortunately for colleges and universities, the numbers of counselors and faculty and staff of color doesn't come close to measuring up to the number of students who actually need the help. So we know now that there's about 40% of college and university students are students of color, and that number is rising. And there are a number of things that happen when students come from their family, their community, into the environment of the college itself, the campus, and the student body. And we know that there's an incredible amount of anxiety and excitement. And I should say right at the outset that these sorts of risk factors, perhaps, things that might affect their transition and their adjustment, can also be coupled with resilience factors. So we like to say that risk factors are not predictive factors because of protective factors. And I believe that a lot of students come to school with those resilience and protective factors, things such as a strong faith, a strong supportive culture back home, a sense of culture, an identity that is clear, and students are able to seek out peers people who look like them, people who have similar beliefs to them. But some of the other students actually, through a Healthy Minds study and then through our survey that we did with the JED Foundation just a few years ago, found that Black students, for example, are much less common, they're less frequently reporting that they are transitioning well to college. They are feeling higher rates of distress around that entry period of time. So we actually work with a lot of high school students. There's a lot of nonprofit organizations that work to help prepare students for college. We're working with them to address these mental health and emotional wellness issues. Before I turn it over to my colleagues, I wanted to just mention also that some of the things that the students of color experience, and I'm sure most of you coming from the campus environment will recognize some of these terms and have probably addressed these issues and concerns with your students. Things like stigma, I mentioned. There's still an amazing stigma against receiving help, seeking help. Racial microaggressions. Microaggressions are common and hard to react to, hard to respond to for many students. Stereotype threat. Imposter syndrome is very large, particularly for first generation students, but really for all students. And students of color have a harder time trying to fit in with that predominantly white organization, institution, and they feel like they have to measure up and they feel like they have to somehow be an imposter through that experience. They get a sense of isolation, longing, need for belonging to a group, and this lack of resilience in many cases. And what that does is it actually leads to academic issues and results. Things like disengagement from the campus environment, a negative academic self-concept, a weak social support network, a stereotype threat, self-doubt. Actually grades will definitely get impacted, and again, there's this missing link between trying to get to those of you who are in the counseling offices. There's a lack of engagement, if you will, to actually go and seek help. So this runs across all what we call intersectional identities. This is an incredibly transitional time in a person's life, so all these things are going on, and we find that what we are really looking to do is trying to dig deeper, find out some of the reasons why this is happening. Moreover, we're trying to figure out tools and ways that we can help support students so that we can help turn the tide on some of the rates of suicide and other serious mental illness on campus. So I've probably talked too much, but I want to turn it over to my colleagues.
Yeah, thank you, Deidre. And I wonder, from the other panelists, are there things you would like to add?
I'll just add, I'm Micah Griffin from Alabama A&M University, which is, if you aren't aware, is a historically black college and university located in Huntsville, Alabama. But I'll just, I guess, echo some of the things Deidre said that we see a lot. Most of our student population is African American, and they do come from a lot of disadvantaged backgrounds and underserved communities where, one, mental health is not discussed. Also, some of those other behavioral factors and health factors that students talk about or that we see in our health and counseling centers aren't discussed. So those students are already presenting on campus with some of these preconceived ideas and notions where mental health is you go to the church and you pray it away and you discuss it and you don't actually go seek help. So we're combating a lot of barriers that these students are already presented on campus with. So you couple that with trying to get them to understand how academics relates to mental health and mental fitness, along with even some of those physical health aspects that we address in our health and counseling center. So there's a lot of barriers that are existing for students of color that present on predominantly white institutions, as well as historically black colleges and universities. So we're experiencing some of those same challenges, irregardless of the type of campus the student is on. They're still presenting with those challenges because of the communities they come from, as well as some of those factors that those students have with their familial supports, as well as some of those socioeconomic factors. So that was just echoing what you said, that we do see that on our campus as well. Even though a lot of our practitioners and our service providers are of color, or people of color, we still have students that they just, for whatever reason, don't want to access those services. So we're combating that a lot with creating student programs that are student-led. A lot of our marketing materials and our social media aspects have students of color that look like them, so that way they can see some of these people and they can recognize some of these factors, that they can see that, hey, it's okay to access some of these services. So that was just kind of echoing what you had said, that we see that a lot as well in our HBCU campuses.
Thank you, Micah. And
Yeah, I was going to actually expand a little bit because in relation to well-being overall, I think mental health is one of the most critical issues that we're facing on today's campuses for sure. And as Deidre and Micah both talked about the campus climate and relation to that, microaggressions is one aspect, but we do have to acknowledge not only race issues, but also kind of our social, or our media's, the publicity around certain media events recently is creating a lot of discussion on campuses, and how we're handling that within our student health centers and campuses is really critical to how our students feel safe, to how our students feel welcome. At my institution, we had an incident of hate speech last fall, and the students are still talking about it, and they're still talking about how that doesn't make them feel comfortable. And if we can't address that as an institution, that's certainly impacting their mental health and their ability to study and those kinds of critical issues. So well-being is really, encompasses a lot. So I just wanted to kind of toss that out there too.
And to echo on that, I'd say that ties right into a sense of belonging on campus. And when students don't feel like they belong, the risk of them experiencing negative mental health outcomes is much higher. And so, in speaking to some of the recent events that have happened, that have had a lot of media attention on the national spotlight, whatever side of the spectrum a student falls on, they could be impacted by what's going on in the media and how different people on campus, staff, faculty, and other students alike are responding to it. And so that in itself, we have to understand that all of our students are being affected no matter what side of the spectrum they're falling on.
thank you very much. I'm going to move on to the next question, and I'm going to direct it to Sara. I want to address how the needs of the student population have changed over time, especially as the national student body has increasingly diversified. What trends, needs, and changes have you seen over time, and where do you think some of those trends are leading?
Okay. So I'm going to give a little background about some of the demographics of our campuses today, because I think it's really helpful as we consider our university students. Sometimes we still have in our mindset the traditional college-age student coming straight from high school, predominantly white, middle class or affluent, and that's just not the reality of the student population that we see today. As Deidre mentioned, we know that about 45% of students nationally are non-white, and that's going to vary by region. Where I'm from in Texas, we have about 61% of students are non-white. If we look at California, about 70% of students are non-white. If we go back to Ohio, where I grew up, 70% are white. Right? And so as we look at the demographics in our region, it's important to understand what that means, because it's not about just the sense of belonging and culture that we experience on campus, but students of color also have other components to who they are that impact their ability at the institution. And that relates to specific things like financial income or SES status that might be related. We know that a lot of the students that are students of color may be parenting. And one of that, we see that about 47% of Black students are actually parents. We know that about 42% of Native American students are parents. And I bring up parenting as a factor that a lot of us don't consider how being a parent impacts students' academics. But if you're trying to balance that priority and make it to class on time, but you have to drop your kid off at daycare, or the daycare is not open, or you can't afford daycare, you got to think about those kinds of issues, and I'll talk a little bit more about needs, but I guess I want to give some more of those demographic areas. One of the increases in race really relates to the increase in Hispanic students. There's been about a 240% increase in Hispanic enrollment. And we see that increase not quite as high for Black students, but it's about 72% compared to about 11% of white students. So the demographics are shifting in our colleges today, and we need to be aware of what that means. We also know that a lot of students are first-gen. Deidre mentioned that. At my campus, we have about a 60% first-gen student population. What that means is that students don't know how to navigate general issues about college, filling out a FAFSA, but that also means they don't know what student health services is, or counseling services, or how to go seek help, because they may not have those skills or anybody at home to direct them. We see that a lot of our students nationally have financial issues. 60% are on Pell Grants nationally. 62% of our students nationally work. Again, thinking about balancing our student health needs and thinking of homelessness and food, 62% of students working, about 36% of them are working part-time, 26% are working about full-time. They're balancing a lot, just trying to find the funds to have shelter and food and also still be a student. So those are some of the changing, big, broad demographics that we need to be aware of, and understanding how they're trying to balance all of that becomes a really critical issue, right? As we're looking at finances, as we're looking at mental health, we talked a lot about that, stress. As students we're trying to meet their needs, are we really looking at the student population that we currently have, or are we considering the student population who we had 20 years ago? And making sure that we're being comprehensive. I would also like to point out that we have about 38% of undergrads are actually 25 years or older. So again, that older population relates to that. We have about 5% of students who are undergrads who are veterans. I'm a military USA in San Antonio, and we have a huge proportion of students in Texas who are veterans, and that's because of something called the Hazelwood Act, which actually allows any veteran to get free tuition at any Texas public institution. So we have a very large proportion of students who are veterans. And are we meeting their needs? Because they're coming to campus with very different needs, both related to mental health, food insecurity, sometimes homelessness. Related to after their service, and they're trying to adjust back to civilian life. And so being aware of veterans is another population. And then international students, since 1970, we've seen about a 3% increase in international students, and that will also change your campus climate. So what does your campus look like as far as how you're meeting all of these different student population needs? And I think it's important that you understand your own campus so that you can determine what are the ways that we need to look at them. I'd like to share a little bit about parents, just because I think I've actually done some research lately related to student mothers, and it's a fascinating population. I'm at a Hispanic serving institution, and a lot of our students are student parents, and a lot of them are single mothers. And what we find is that their ability to actually attend class is being impacted by their ability, their parenting. And that's because there's not flexibility in schedules. They can't afford daycare. What happens when their child is sick? There's no policy on campus. What do they do with their sick child? And classes may not coincide with when they're available for daycare. There's a class that's only offered on Saturdays. How am I supposed to do that? I can't get daycare. And so thinking of the needs of our students is a lot more diverse today than what we may traditionally think of, oh, they're a student, that's all they're doing, they're 18, 19 years old. That's not the reality of our students today. They're juggling a part-time job or a full-time job. They're juggling being a parent. They're dealing with financial issues because they're trying to also maybe help support their family. Again, at a Hispanic serving institution, a lot of my students are working not just to support their family, but their extended family. And that's a really important thing that we need to understand, because we need to broaden our perspective of meeting those needs, both from a wellness perspective, but also from an institutional standpoint. Anyway, sorry, that sounded a little preachy, didn't mean it like that, but I'm really passionate about making sure we're meeting each of our individual students' needs, because I think it's important.
Thank you, Sara. I'm wondering if any of the other panelists would like to contribute to that.
Sure. I'd say one additional population to consider is that, I don't have the statistics or any of the numbers in front of me, but one of the fastest growing populations in terms of diversity and race is actually multiracial and multi-ethnic students. And how is that going to impact our campuses down the road as well, in terms of like, they're back to the sense of belonging, but if they don't fit in a particular box, I think our students, our campuses are still operating a little bit in silos, and it's not catching up to the needs of multiracial and multi-ethnic students that sometimes feel left out of the conversation when services are targeted to certain marginalized populations, and they might not fit one, or if they don't fit all of them, or if they don't fully fit in one, they might feel completely left out of the conversation. And so that's just one thing to consider, that growing population.
And another, I would just add to that diversity component, the gender based issues that students feel. As I mentioned earlier, this, and you all obviously know that this 18 to 25 transitional time in people's lives is when a lot of identities are really formed and sort of secured and for folks. And by the way, that's when mental illness sometimes first occurs too. A lot of people experience their first episode during that time. But we look beyond mental illness to the notion of this well-being state. And I would just like to bring us back to that. But gender is really a big part of this conversation, because Latino students, as a great example, so they feel these pressures coming from being parents and coming from often from income challenging backgrounds or current situations, and then perhaps they have this gender identity on top of that. There is a broad range, really, of concerns and personal things that they have to deal with. So this notion of how do we address it and really work toward a state of well-being and working from that notion of, unique well-being for each student, personally, I think, is the answer, rather than constantly trying to hit on all the risk factors. So I think it's a great conversation to start around how do we meet some of these needs so that we can bring students and find out from students themselves what well-being means to them, and then we know what we can do to help them.
And I'd actually like to, if you don't mind, Micah, I don't know if you're going to talk. I wanted to tag on with what Mickey said, because you triggered something in my head that I think was one area that we haven't touched on is sexual and gender minorities. And as we think about, no longer having categories of gay, bi, or straight, right, we've got this diversity within that group that are they finding a place at campus for people who are gender nonconforming or gender queer or pansexual or omnisexual, or maybe not even labeling themselves as another population with their own, that potentially can have different aspects and needs that need to be considered.
And I'll just add something too, and this is something that I've always in our staff meetings, and we always discuss and hit on what you said. I always ask, are we surviving or are we thriving? And I think that's something that's very important as it relates to wellness. Are we just trying to have the absence of disease, or are we actually trying to have a holistic wellness environment where we're hitting on all the dimensions of wellness? And I think that speaks to what we're talking about as it relates to providing services for students of color or ethnic minorities. That are we just providing services to just get you by, or are we trying to actually change some of those health behaviors and belief systems that you can not only thrive while you're on campus, but also when you graduate, which is what our goals are, is that when you become an adult, that you take some of these same concepts and belief systems that we embedded in you while you were in college, and you carry those on into your 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s. So now you're living a long, happy, healthy life. And I think that's very important as we talk about what is wellness and how we impacting our students who come from backgrounds that don't necessarily understand or even implement some of those aspects of wellness.
You're actually building upon the resilience.
Exactly.
So they carry it with them all life. Yep.
Thank you, everyone. And Micah, I'm going to ask if you can elaborate a little bit as we talk about a lot of the challenges that we've identified today. I wonder if you can talk about how those challenges differ based on the institution, and more specifically, what obstacles and issues do HBCUs or community colleges face that larger schools might not?
Definitely. Well, as it relates to historically black colleges, I think one of the biggest pieces is understanding why historically black colleges were even created. A lot of people, when you say HBCUs, they don't really know what HBCUs are. They believe that we serve 100% African American students, that we are always underfunded, that we're never in the topic of conversation, that we're these small colleges that are all liberal arts and we're just teaching our students about English and writing and that's about it. When in reality, historically black colleges, there are about 101 that currently exist in this country now that serve over 200,000 students on an annual basis that provide degrees from certificates all the way up to PhDs, and we have some of the largest number of African American students graduating with degrees in STEM from institutions like Florida A&M, Alabama A&M, Southern, Hampton University, as well as Meharry and Howard University right here in DC that provide some of the largest medical degrees for African Americans as well. So I think when we're talking about the role historically black colleges play as it relates to health and wellness, we really have to understand why these colleges were founded. One being during the time when African Americans weren't permitted or allowed to attend other institutions, predominantly white institutions. These colleges were created out of need and out of necessity. They were mission driven, which is one of the main premises why historically black colleges were created, and is why those colleges even exist today, to provide opportunities for students that come from some of these backgrounds or some of these underserved communities that might not have the grades or might not have had some of that same access to opportunity that a lot of other counterparts had. They're still able to gain and have access to a quality education. So that's what the real premise or the foundation of why historically black colleges were created, and some of the main reasons as to why those institutions still exist today. And just like I was saying before, historically black colleges serve about 220,000 students, I think, nationally were enrolled last year in these institutions, and there are 101 that are still operating today, from schools that have 1,000 students all the way up to your large institutions like Howard University or Florida A&M that serve upwards of 15 to 20,000 students. And when you have students like that, where your primary mission is to serve students of color, we have to understand that that dynamic is shifting as well, because even though historically black colleges are HBCUs, we have a lot of students that aren't African American or students of color that are attending these institutions. So not only do we have to focus on providing services for our students of color that are attending these institutions, but we also have to provide services for students that were normally the majority but are now falling into that category of being considered the minority on these institutions. So that's an interesting dynamic when you're thinking about it. But some of the same factors or some of the same issues that students experience at predominantly white institutions, we have some of those same issues at historically black colleges. And I think sometimes they get compounded because you have students that weren't necessarily afforded or given some of those same opportunities in middle school, in high school, and then now they're presenting on these college campuses where they might not have had the same high GPA or some of those same test scores, but they still have a desire to learn and they still want to attend and do better. And I think that's what you really have to focus on when you're providing, services for these students. Some of the biggest, I think, roadblocks or obstacles that we face in historically black colleges is access to funding. Some of my other colleagues from other HBCUs can probably attest to this. Even though I'm the director of student health and counseling, I probably wear a lot of hats. I'm not wearing one of them today, but I wear a lot of hats. I serve on a lot of different committees and different boards, and we have that same culture of just get it done. And we still have to get it done because, we have to prepare our students to go out into a world to be prepared and be able to compete globally. And we're still having to do this with half the budget, less resources, less staff, less adequate buildings and facilities, outdated materials, outdated infrastructure, but we're still having to provide and we're still having to go above and beyond to ensure that we're providing services for a majority African American population and still ensure that they, still have some of these same aspects and still address some of these same components of wellness that we're talking about. Because as many of you know, we're talking about chronic disease. A lot of students and a lot of people that are dealing with chronic diseases such as diabetes, obesity, heart disease, high cholesterol, that's all preventable. A lot of times African Americans suffer disproportionately from some of these same issues. So when you look at a population in whole in America where African Americans are dying or suffering from some of these preventable diseases, what are you doing to combat that in an institution where the majority of your population is African American? So what we're really trying to do is change a lot of these students' behaviors, and I think that's what we're really focusing on at Alabama A&M, is creating a culture of campus health, which is our mission from our Student Health and Counseling Center. It's not just we're here as a health center that gives you condoms when you need them, or we're just here as the last resort when you're feeling depressed. We're trying to really address wellness and create an entire culture of campus, a culture of campus health, where all of our services are now being integrated as it relates to different units on campus. So when the Office of Residence Life is having events, we're trying to make sure that we're involved in that. Or homecoming is actually happening this week at Alabama A&M, and you would think that when homecoming happens, if any of you haven't attended HBCU homecoming, I would encourage you to do that. Howard University is here in DC, or whatever state that you're in. It's amazing. You will be surprised. You would think that this HBCU, that our primary goal is having homecoming, because everything shuts down from, I mean, classes even canceled. You take that out the recording, don't put that. But just take, let's block that part out. But you would think that when homecoming happens on campus that everything shuts down, which it can be good and bad, because, you know, you look at, well, we're putting all of this emphasis and priority into homecoming, into this 1 week. Why aren't we allocating some of these same resources throughout the year to our other important services, like our student affairs, like our counseling center, like our health and counseling center? So what we really have to do is be creative. And I'm saying all that to say is when you are underfunded and when you have limited resources, you have to be really creative. So what we're doing this week in particular is making sure that every single homecoming event that we have some type of presence, whether it's just giving out what we call adult goodie bags, which has condoms in it, which has sexual health information, which has our contact information. We're making sure that our presence is there, because a lot of times health and wellness is not always a priority, not just for African Americans, but also for historically black colleges. So we have to make it a priority. We have to find creative ways to integrate our services. One thing we've done that we've been very successful as is we created a Student Health Alliance, which is the first student-led organization coming out of the Student Health and Counseling Center, where now we're giving our students the opportunity to take the lead and to create initiatives and programs where now they're the front-facing advocates that give out information. So it's not just me saying, hey, do this, do that. We have students that we're training as peer educators that can go out and really be the face of the Health and Counseling Center. And that's what they're doing this week during homecoming, where we have thousands of alumni that's coming back on campus, and we know the students are engaged. We know that they're out there trying to party, and where we're saying, hey, well, while you're partying and while you're doing this, make sure you keep this in mind. So being visible, being present, and always ensuring that health and counseling and wellness is at the forefront and the priorities. And I think as I'm gonna close out, because I was a professor as well, so I might just start talking. So I tell somebody in the back just to do like this if I start talking too much. But I think another population that I think HBCUs aren't really focusing on is that LGBTQ population. Because a lot of times, especially in the black community, LGBTQ issues isn't really a priority, and there's a lot of stigma associated around providing services and ensuring that African American students that identify in this community have resources and have a place where they feel included on campus. So one thing that we're trying to do, and we partner with several other HBCU campuses, is to provide resources on our campus so that not only do our students feel included, but that they also feel like they have a place where their voice is being heard. So I think that's something too, as we're talking about historically black colleges, to keep in mind that within that demographic, there's also a smaller community that exists as well. So you compound being African American, and then you add being an African American student on a historically black college campus that identifies as LGBTQ. So now you have 2 layers of stigma and 2 layers that you have to really combat. So I say all that to say we have a lot of challenges. But I feel like I'm very optimistic with the direction that we're going, with being included in organizations like ACHA, that we can really change the dynamic and ensure that HBCUs that have been around since the early 1800s will continue to flourish and continue to provide a safe space and resources for our students of color that choose to attend historically black colleges.
Thank you, Micah.
Thank you.
And I would open it to any of the panelists who might want to add anything.
So So I know Micah really talked a lot about the HBCUs. One of the components of your question, I think, also addressed community colleges. And we have a pretty strong community college presence in San Antonio that feeds into my institution. So I have a lot of students who have attended community colleges. And we know that about 40% of students nationally attend a community college at least for a semester. So it is another area where we could potentially be looking at wellness and health. Unfortunately, much like you were talking about with HBCUs, community colleges don't often have the resources or even an office, right? That's a point office on their campus to address these issues. So I just wanted to point out that while we see a lot of our students attending these institutions, they may not have any kind of wellness experience at that campus, and that's something that we as a nation and college health need to really be looking at.
Thank you, Sara. So I'm going to move on to a final question, and I'm going to ask Pritma Mickey to discuss what role the institution should play in assisting the students in finding success in their academic career. How do we meet their basic needs, provide mental health and wellness services, as well as other services?
Okay. So I wanted to start answering this question by talking about our role on college campuses. So those of us who work on college or university campuses understand that everyone has a role as an educator, whether we are a faculty member, a staff member, an administrator, the student nurse, somebody who works in auxiliary services, an RA, we all have a role as an educator. And so we also know that healthy students do better academically. So I think the role of us supporting academic success for students is to educate and to teach them how to live healthy lifestyles. That's where our health promotion units come in so crucially and are why they are so important for campuses. Whether it's one person or an entire unit of staff, the education around how to, how to practice good sexual health behaviors, how to practice good, healthier or less risky substance use, how to address mental health needs, how to increase quality of sleep. All of these things impact a student's academic success. So if we can teach them how to achieve those things, to take on past college into their working worlds and as adults, then I think that's like key right there. We understand that students are coming from all different types of backgrounds, and high school education where this stuff is talked about a lot or not at all. And so I think getting just a baseline of education for students is the first step for teaching them success on how to achieve academically as well, and bringing them up to speed on what are some of those health issues that they might not be as aware of as some of their counterparts coming from high school backgrounds or private schools where they were really taught some of the comprehensive sexual health education or substance use education, mental health education. Tied to this, though, is the need for us as educators to illustrate the connection that health and well-being has to academic success and retention for our administrators, for our campus leaders, so that they can continue to fund us and continue to support our units on campus. When it comes to addressing basic needs of students, so I'm thinking shelter, food, sleep, air, all that, the basic bottom of the pyramid for the hierarchy of needs. We really need to consider what resources our students have access to and what barriers there might be in addressing or accessing those resources. So, when it comes to food access, are we considering, are we able to have a food pantry on campus? Are we able to provide a farmer's market, and partner with our community members on the campus? I know that some universities are able to bring a farmer's market every week throughout the entire year. That's great. Are other campuses who are more isolated, are they able to do the same? Are we able to offer different levels of meal plans? I know some schools say, like, if you're a student living on campus, it is mandated that you have a meal plan, and this is the only meal plan that you're allowed to have, right? And so what are we doing to offer a variety of different meal plans and costs for our students? When it comes to housing, are we able to have reduced cost housing? Are we able, especially for those of us who are in urban environments or more expensive cities, metropolitan areas where on-campus housing can be extremely expensive. We're also dealing with the competition of having more affordable housing off campus, right? And so is the university doing what they can to try to make housing a little bit more affordable for students so that they can stay on campus and be more supported as a result? Are we, when it comes to sleep, are we addressing how our residence halls or our classrooms are supporting students' sleep or not supporting their sleep? Is the residence hall that has the most amount of students up against a really busy road? Are faculty members talking about if you're in my class, you should only be getting 5 hours of sleep to be successful in this class, because we've heard that from students. So those types of things to address the basic needs. But even further than that, what do we call needs on campus, right? So is a faculty member or is somebody saying, like, in order for you to be successful in my class, you need to have a laptop in class, or you need, everyone, take out your cell phones. What if somebody doesn't have a cell phone with them right now and they're not able to participate in the poll that the class is doing or in the activity that they're doing with their classmates? So what are we telling our students that are needed on campus in order to be successful? And touching on Sarah's point about the increased percentage of students who are parents, are we addressing the childcare needs? Are we addressing, just like she said, about class start and end times? Are they coinciding with drop-off time and pickup time for students who are parents, and are they able to meet those needs? Because that can definitely create another level or another barrier to academic success. I could go on and on here. There's so many things that are basic, what you consider basic needs for students. But I challenge us to think about what are we saying our needs are, not just what are actually our needs. In terms of providing services around mental health or wellness services, ideally, it would be great, it would be the best to be able to offer comprehensive primary physical health and mental health services on campus for all students for free, right? That would be the ideal. That's not the reality for most of our campuses. And so when that is not the reality or not realistic for our campuses, especially our smaller campuses, our community colleges, I think the number one thing here is our responsibility as an institution is to create access for students to be able to meet their physical and mental health needs, right? So whether that is on campus or providing that easy access to off-campus resources. That means also fostering relationships with community resources, with providers in our area, and getting to know those resources, not just like, oh, that's an office that's down the street, but like knowing the staff in those offices so that you can make a personal recommendation by name to somebody. Understanding so building those relationships, but then also at the same time understanding the barriers to accessing resources off campus, right, in our communities, whether that is transit time. It could only be 2 miles off campus, but it could take 45 minutes to get there via the public bus, right? And so what does that mean for our students? And then I'd say in addition for services on campus, making an intentional effort on our campuses to have our departments reflect our student bodies in terms of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, et cetera. So I think if you are in an HBCU, if most of if your providers are able to be Black and African American to match your student body, that's great. If you're at a university where you have a lot of mixture in terms of diversity, making sure that it's not just a predominantly white staff and faculty so that students do not see themselves reflected in them, because that does create a barrier for students to access those support systems if they don't feel that anybody can relate to them, especially in the mental health world.
Thank you, Mickey. And I would invite any of the other panelists to add to what Mickey has.
Yeah, I wanted to, if I could, just say a couple of things. I really appreciated what you just talked about, Mickey, and I was linking it to what you were talking about, Micah, about being creative and how to serve all these needs. What I'm sort of summarizing in my head is all these different populations and all these different needs and these barriers, and and so forth. And it seems like, there are creative ways that are needed. The Steve Fund works across the country with a lot of different universities and colleges. And a couple of years ago, we worked really closely with the JED Foundation to both work from survey data through the Harris poll that we had conducted to develop something we call an equity and mental health framework. And it's basically a list of 10 recommendations, very tangible recommendations with strategies underneath each of those. And many of them touch on exactly what you just talked about. And you can, if you want to, we have a website, stevefund.org, and I would encourage you to go and you can look into more about the framework and our other resources. We have a lot of really great resources there. But in particular, this notion when we talk about needs of students, and we know from the demographics, we know from the statistics that come in from admissions and counseling and so forth, we often don't know what the untold needs are of students who don't report or don't check in. So it's really hard sometimes to do that outreach. And so one of the things that we are strong proponents of is incorporating students in any kind of identification of needs. So to hear directly from students, this peer support, peer-based focus groups, informal groups, where, people can really talk about what their needs are, because what we're basically saying is that there is a huge silent portion of students that are suffering, and they don't have a way of, there's this stigma against getting help. Sometimes they don't know about the services. Sometimes they go and they experience a counselor who doesn't look like them. Even when they do, it's hard to make that connection. So we really encourage that sort of nothing about us without us mentality. If we are creating programs and activities and offerings and services for students, let's make sure that we include them in both identifying needs and in designing programs that in truth do serve them. So I just wanted to mention that. And I do have a one-pager, it's a two-sided one-pager about our equity and mental health framework, if anybody would like to view it afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Deidre.
I'll just add that, and she didn't pay me for this, but that framework is very important. We actually used that about a year ago to integrate into our counseling services. We actually use a framework called a comprehensive counseling model, along with that framework where we have counselors that are now we use graduate assistants, so we have a psychology and counseling graduate program. We take graduate interns every semester that actually goes out, and they serve on something called a student advisory committee. Where once a month, those students that from that program actually meet with myself, several other administrators on campus that actually give us feedback, and they go out and have conversations with students, both formal and informal, where they're getting feedback on how our services could be improved, what are we missing, what areas aren't we hitting on, and that framework was very important with us shaping that program. We actually have something else that I want to encourage you all to consider that we had a lot of success with. We have something called Connect Centers on campus, where they're located in our academic buildings, because if you aren't familiar, the way our campus is situated on a hill. So half of our campus is on a hill that's a huge incline. It's very beautiful when you're driving up on it. But the bad thing about it is our health and counseling center is all the way on the other side of campus. When in our minds, if you're sick, that's not really a big deal. But take an 18, 19, 20-year-old who doesn't even want to walk 2 stairs or downstairs or upstairs, and then you situate your health and counseling center all the way on the other side of campus. So now we're talking about access. So what we did was we have these things called Connect Centers. They're actually inside of the academic building. So in our School of Social Work and our School of Business, they have these kind of creative little workspaces. Just think about like a Starbucks without the expensive coffee. It's a lounge area, there's meeting spaces, there's a room where students can go meet up and talk and discuss, and these centers were really being underutilized. So what we did was we said, let's use some of these models from this framework, let's actually take our services to where the students are. So now they can't say, well, you guys are all the way across campus. No, we have counselors that are in those Connect Centers 3 days a week. and they have private rooms where you can do one-on-one counseling. They do group sessions. We do presentations where we do discussions on substance abuse, intimate partner violence. So now we're removing some of those barriers, and I think that's the big thing as it exists to not only educating students about mental health, but also getting them to understand that it's not just a place you go when you have an issue, it's where you go for mental fitness and mental wellness. And we've seen a lot of success in that. Our students are now coming asking, hey, where is the Connect Center meeting at? Where are these counselors at? And now, like I said, we're removing that barrier, and now not only are we making ourselves more visible, but now these students are starting to recognize, oh, that's our doctor, that's our counselor. So now when they see us, they can recommend, say, hey, this student really, or this counselor really, made me feel better. They really are helping me out because I went into Connect Center and saw them versus having to walk all the way across campus. So that was just two components as I was thinking about how that framework we really took that and put it into practice. So it's been very beneficial for us.
Thank you, Micah.
I have a couple questions online, but the first one for the panel to consider is students with housing and food insecurity often need ongoing mental health services. What are your thoughts about providing these services on campus?
Well, I don't believe any of us are clinicians at the table, but so I don't know if we can speak directly to clinical services for mental health and physical health needs, but and I'm not sure if I will answer the question thoroughly here either. But one thought to consider is that I don't believe the role of the institution is to sustainably offer free and ongoing, services throughout the entire student's career at a campus. I think it's essential for us to at least meet the student in the beginning, find out where they're at, and then either determine that we're able to see them on campus and that we are the appropriate place for them, or to successfully connect them with a community resource and follow up with the student. Don't just say, here's a resource, go, good luck. You know what I mean? So that's what I'll have to say about that.
And I would ask if any of the rest of you have things that you would like to add to that.
Well, I would say that that need in particular is one of many needs, or two of many needs that students have, and I think if campuses can follow some of the guidance that we've been talking about, these Connect Centers, just the access to services, the notion of creating conversations and supporting conversations, having a presence around campus health and wellness, having a presence in the residence halls, and engaging the faculty and other staff and administration who have a lot of contact with students, and very often they're the ones who form close relationships with students. If they are not comfortable with going to a counselor, very often they talk to their professor. And I think it's important for everybody who is on campus. You talked earlier about everybody being an educator on campus. I think, just being aware of some of these needs and then being able to refer them to services is really important. So.
And I think something too, I just thought about another department that I think is underutilized. I know on our campus we have an Office of Disability Services, and one thing that we work with them a lot on is providing accommodations for students. And she isn't a social worker, but she kind of serves in that case management capacity where she helps remove some of those barriers and provide access to some of those off-campus resources. So if there's a student who, for instance, maybe might be recovering from a mental illness, or maybe verbalize or made suicidal ideations, and now they're needing psychological evaluation. So when they come back on campus, instead of them just coming right back into the student population, they might need certain accommodations from their professors, or even as we're talking about access to food services, or even we have some students on campus that have support animals. So that's another option. And like I said, we don't work, she isn't necessarily in our office, but we work with her a lot for especially those students that are suffering from some of those mental illnesses or need certain accommodations. She helps provide or bridge that gap because she has a lot of resources off campus, so that's something to consider as well.
And similarly, if you have a Veteran Affairs office on your campus, they provide that role on our campus a lot to students navigating mental health issues for veterans, and also looking at resources related to food and shelter for our veterans as well. So depending on your resources on campus, there may be some other organizations that you can tap into.
I would also just add that technology on campus is a huge area of potential support for students, particularly students of color who might not easily seek assistance. We work, for example, with Crisis Text Line. We have developed a moniker if students text Steve to the crisis text line number. They will be connected with a crisis counselor of color, and that's an immediate connection that in many cases, if they're not comfortable seeking in-person services to discuss this or other needs, they are more comfortable with texting in particular. The other one that we partner with is 7 Cups, and that's an online chat service. And we have a presence with them so that students who, there's different groups within the online program and platform, and students find a great deal of support that way. They get into group discussions or individual discussions, again, with people who look like them and come from similar backgrounds. So I think the role of technology can be a really incredibly good strength for all students.
And I'd like to tag on to that, but kind of go in a slightly different tangent, because a lot of our conversation today has really been around physical and in-person services. And as I was doing some of the research to come to the panel, I also found out that there are about 14% of our undergraduate students are solely online. So what are we doing to meet their needs when we think about the diversity? And I think, that tacks on to what Deidre's saying as far as how are we tapping into that population that's not coming to campus? Are we doing Skype sessions? Are we doing, for counseling? Or what resources are we providing to our completely online students? Because I think it's a really important population, and I think it's probably also going to be one that's changing. At my institution, I know there's increased emphasis or there's encouragement to increase enrollment, and one of the easy ways to do that when you're physically limited in your space to actually have students is to increase that online presence. But we really need to be diligent and thoughtful in ensuring that those students have the resources they need, especially around issues related to food insecurity or homelessness, because we won't see them, right? I might be able to have that conversation in class with somebody if I can see something going on, but if they're online, there's a lot more invisibility or an ability to hide that, whatever they're dealing with.
And I think that's a follow-up question was regarding exactly kind of where you were going, but so mind reader. But with off-campus students, particularly, but I guess that would also be online. How do you ensure that there's a comprehensive care framework in place to provide for the well-being services to those students?
So at a former university that I was at, they had an office that was dedicated to off-campus student support services it was kind of known as a commuter campus, but it wasn't. And so I think that that office, though, is extremely helpful in meeting students' needs for where they're at. So, I mean, it seems simple, but like being able to provide a free breakfast every week, and it's like the commuter, breakfast, or being able to provide classes and services and programs that are geared towards students that commute, geared towards students that are sometimes on campus, usually during evening hours, or who are here to just come to class and leave, come to class, go to their job, come to class, go home to take care of their family. Mm-hmm. And so how do you engage those students in like the traditional like programming, right? And so that office was dedicated to being able to figure that out. And I think that, not every campus is able to have a resource like that, and that's understandable. But for the schools that, if you identify that you do have a significant commuter population, this is something that I think is essential for your student success and for the students' health and well-being. Being able to bring a provider, to do a workshop or to do a group session or something with commuter students in a space that they're comfortable and familiar with is going to be helpful as well. So partnering with a lot of a lot of campuses, if they don't have a specific office like that, they might have a subdivision within their housing or residential life office that serves off-campus students, connects them with housing, with apartment tours off campus or within the community of the campus, or understands how to put them in touch with different needs that commuter students have.
Thank you, Mickey.
Go ahead, Sara.
Yeah, no, I was thinking more about this, and I think, echoing everything Mickey said, it is really a critical issue, and understanding how to meet their needs is, I know the next session is like meeting students' needs and surveying your students and all that, but you really need to know your students and what their needs are. As I mentioned, I was doing some focus groups with student mothers, and what I found was that they were like cramming me in between classes, but then when I would be like, well, could you come this day? They're like, no, I'm not on campus, or no, they're very, very structured, very, very complex schedules and coordination among our commuter student and population. They're often balancing those three things, right? They're balancing school, work, and potentially parenting or family life, and how do you navigate that and fit in that comprehensive wellness that you're talking about? It's not a priority for them. And one of the things that I think is a struggle in college health is that we need to figure out how to make it a priority. Micah talked about for our traditional college-age students, helping them learn skills that they can deal with throughout their life. But if I'm talking to a 28-year-old mother who's got 2 kids, who's sleeping 2 hours a night because she's trying to pay the bills and get to class and take care of her kids and do her homework, work with her kids for homework, how do I tell her sleep's really important? She's like, I don't have the time, Sara. I'm trying to get through life. And so we really need to kind of figure that out, and that's tough. There's not an easy answer there. I don't have the answer. I just see the struggle. And it is something that we really need to be addressing, because I think, again, that mindset of the commuter population is so much more complex than go to school, go to your class, and learn how to be healthy, because they're not able to in an easy way.
At the same time, self-care is so important to make it through all that. So I would just emphasize the need to ask the people themselves what would help you, I agree. They're just trying to make it through the day and get everything done. The notion of self-care, whether it's some mindfulness, maybe they would appreciate having something to, a one-pager or something to relax them, maybe a tape to help them get to sleep. Anything to help them move through a space where they can sort of feel themselves get to a better place and support themselves. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you. And I was just going to say, it's a perfect segue to thank everyone for joining us and to really give the audience food for thought. So thank you to the panelists for joining us. Thank you to the audience members and those who are live streaming. I do hope that you found this panel informative and helpful, and also that it plants seeds for continued conversation on your respective campuses. And our next session, our next discussion will be tailoring approaches to meet the needs of your campus community. So again, thank you.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you very much.